Over the next few lessons, we're going to learn how we can have users attach images, like one that they might take from their phone, or images from their photo library, which will of course then appear within their diary entry. So we're going to start in this lesson with the basics of accessing these device resources from our application. Now let's start with the interface. We're going to start by adding in these buttons that are going to serve as the triggers for requesting access to our user's camera or photo library. So within our diary entry create and edit view here, I'm going to add a group to start with here. I'm going to add it inside of this group form. I'm going to put it right at the top, and this is going to be our group image. And one of the things that we have to decide when we're displaying images on mobile is how much real estate, how high we want the element that's going to show the image be. Because what we don't want to happen is when we add an image, that image is so tall that it pushes everything else on the page down. So we sort of want to fix the space or pre-allocate the space on our screen where we're going to display the image. We're actually going to use this group image to display the image back out to the user that they've selected. And I'm just going to allow it to stretch the width of the user's screen. That's absolutely fine. But I'm going to fix the height at 320 pixels. And then I want this group to actually look like my other inputs, which of course have a little bit of a border around them. So I'm going to mimic the style properties for my existing inputs on this group. So I'm going to give it a border of 2 pixels wide. I'm going to assign this gray 30 color style, and I'm going to give it just a little bit of roundness so that this group starts to look a little bit like our other inputs. And that's going to set us in good stead for adding in a button to this group. And this is a button that's going to ask the user to take a photo and attach it to their diary entry. However, I don't really want it to have this primary orange background because that's going to clash with our create diary entry button. Generally speaking, we only want to be using our primary color in one place within a view because that's where the user's eye is going to be drawn. That's what's going to signal to them that, hey, this is the most important action that you can take on this view. And if we have more than one important action on the view, that's going to split their focus and potentially confuse them. So from a user experience, UX perspective, we should change the background style of this button to de-emphasize it slightly. And the way that I'm going to do this is by changing the color here to our background color variable, which is just an ever so slight gray, a very light gray. You can see here in the color picker, it's right up in the top left corner here, so very close to white, but not quite white. And then if we add a darker color for the label on the button, and you can see that it stands out slightly from the background there. Now, I also want this button to have an icon. So I'm going to choose icon and label here, and I'm going to choose for my icon this camera icon from the Phosphor library. Let's make sure that we change the icon color here as well so that we can actually see it. And then for this button, I'm going to do something different. I'm going to stack the icon on top of the label as so, and maybe just reduce the gap between them slightly. And I'm even going to bump up the overall height of this button. I'm going to set this to be 80 pixels. So the button just sort of sits there within the view. And if we take a look at what we're actually building towards, we've got 2 buttons here, one to choose an image from the user's photo library and the other one just to take a photo with their camera. So let's create this other button as well while we're here. So I can duplicate this existing button, but just before I do, this style that we've just created on the fly for this button is something that I want to capture because I'm probably going to use this gray background style button in a few other places in my app. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to detach the existing primary style that we overrode earlier, and I'm going to create a new style from this element. And given that this is sort of in line with the style that we created earlier, this link light secondary, it's sort of a secondary action here, a secondary button within the view. So I'm going to stick with our naming convention here, and we'll go with, if this is filled light primary, then our new style is probably filled light secondary. The light here is the fact that this button is designed to be used on a light background, not a dark background. And looks like the icon there when I set the style was reset. So this is a slight bug right now with bubble. So let's reset this manually to our camera icon, and then just duplicate by hitting Command or Control D on your keyboard. And this new button is going to be the button that we use to select from the user's photo library. And as such, let's change the icon as well. I'm going to use this images icon here. Okay, so that's fine and well. Let's improve the design a little bit by centering these buttons within this group image. So what I'm going to do, I'm actually going to hold down Shift here and select both of them, right click, and then group them in their own column layout. And the reason that I want to do that, if we rename it as group image buttons, is because now, from the perspective of the parent container, group image, I can center this single child group by going down to layout and selecting here centered for the alignment of my children. So that's going to put the buttons there in the middle. It also means that for this group here, I can add a little bit of gap spacing. So we'll add here 16, and we'll add some margin on either side here as well, just to give a little bit of breathing room for our buttons. And so if we go and see how this looks right now, we can see, yeah, it looks okay. One of the issues that we have is that when we open this view, we're focusing this title input. We probably don't need to do that. We set that up earlier in the course, but it's a little bit disjointed now because the first action really is to add an image, not to add a title. So let's go into the workflow tab and let's find that action that is happening when the page is loaded to set the focus. And I'm actually going to delete here the whole workflow. So I'm going to click on these three dots, delete workflow. And now it's time to add the logic for what happens when the user clicks one of these buttons. So this is the exciting part, of course. Let's start with taking a photo. So I'm going to add a workflow when this button is tapped. And the action that we're looking for to access the user's camera is under native mobile, open camera. You've got a couple of different options here. Save to camera library means that if the user takes a photo within the context of your app, that photo is also going to be saved to their device. That can be quite a useful thing to do. And make this file private. Just want us to ignore this setting for now. We're going to come back and deal with this later on in the course. And now let's see what happens when we tap this button. So the very first time that you do this, and that your users do this, but in our case, we're doing this via Bubble Go in test mode, of course, is that you're going to see this little modal, as we call it, pop up, which is asking you, the end user, to grant permission to your app for your app to access your camera. So remember our model in the last lesson where your application asks the operating system to provide access to a particular device resource, and the operating system in turn is going to ask the end user if your app is allowed to access that resource. So that's exactly what's happening here. Now, one really important footnote is that we can edit the message that appears here. We're going to get to that later in the course, but it is really important that we do that before we go live, because otherwise the app stores will probably reject our application. We've got to add here a message that makes sense, that is contextual to our use of the device resource in our application. At any rate, so that we can test how this works, I'm going to hit allow. Now we're also being asked to give permission to the photo library. That's because we ticked this box here, save to camera library. So I'm just going to allow full access here. And now you can see, of course, that I'm accessing my device's camera via the app. And so what I can do here is just take a photo, and I can, of course, retake that, which I probably should, but I'm just going to use it for demonstration purposes. And we're back in the app. And at this point, we don't see anything happen on screen. Well, and if we look at our workflow, it's kind of obvious why, right? We haven't actually said that we want to do anything after this action. So what actually happened by running this open camera action in the first place? Well, one really important thing happened. If we go into our data tab and then look under this tab, which we haven't seen before, called the File Manager, this is going to show us all of the files that have been uploaded to our application in one shape or form. So you can see here we've actually got a couple of existing images, which I can click on to just open here in my web browser. And this is, of course, the background that we're using on our home view, right? This is the image that we uploaded earlier. So when we uploaded the image here, and the same thing for our logo, when we uploaded our logo, what Bubble did was it actually stored it within your app's file storage. So you can think of this just like another warehouse, right? Just like your database. This is just another warehouse, but this one is just for files, not for data types, not for structured data, just for files. So in this one, we just throw any file that the user or ourselves as a developer, as it turns out, uploads to our app. And depending on your Bubble plan, you have a certain amount of file storage available. But the important thing for our purposes is you can see this latest image up the top is the one that I uploaded from my phone. But the problem here is that this image is just in our file storage. It's not attached to our diary entry. So we actually need to, within the context of our diary entry, store this image that we just uploaded. So we can create a place where we can store an image by adding a new field on our diary entry, right? This is just another compartment within our diary entry data type. Maybe this is called just image. And then we actually have a field type here called an image, which we can create. And then if we go back to our diary entry form, how could we save this image? So it's been uploaded to our file storage. So can we access it from somewhere? You know, we've got this action to create a new diary entry. We've got this new image field. So what do we set this to? Well, we don't actually have an appropriate data source here. So what we've done is we've uploaded this image to our file storage, but we haven't made it available anywhere within this view. We need to store it somewhere before we can actually attach it to our diary entry. So what do we do here? Well, one thing that's really important to note about this action to access the user's camera, and this will be the same when we access their camera library in a minute, is that if we have another action downstream, let's just say for the sake of argument here that we're creating a new diary entry, well, what we can do is, let's say we're setting the image field here, we can actually, as the data source for this image, grab the result of a previous step. So we have to understand that this open camera action has an output being the photo, the image that the user selected. And that output can be accessed by actions downstream in the workflow, like this create a new diary entry. And so we could set this here to be the result of step one. Now, we don't actually want to be creating a new diary entry here, because we already have a save button up here. Let me actually just call it here, save, right? We've got a button up here, which we set up earlier in the course, which depending on whether we're editing or creating a diary entry is going to, of course, create or edit, make changes to a diary entry. So what we could do is on this workflow here, instead of creating a new diary entry, we could always make changes to the diary entry in that context, right? We can make changes to a diary entry if we're accessing this view in edit mode. Remember, we set up this view initially so that we could create a diary entry within this view and also edit a diary entry within this view. So if we were editing a diary entry, well, we would just grab the diary entry that already exists within the view, and we would just set here the image value to the output of that first step, right? That first workflow action, result of step one. That would be fine, but what do we do when we're creating a new diary entry, right? What do we use as the data source for this image field? So, well, one thing that we could do is store the output of this action, which is an image, just somewhere within the view. We could store it temporarily, perhaps, in some kind of temporary container, temporary holding pen. Do the words that I'm saying trigger anything? Do you remember maybe a concept that we've already learned earlier in the course, which we could use as this temporary holding pen? Well, if you answered custom state, yes, you're absolutely right. We could store the output of this action in a custom state. Now that custom state could live, remember custom states have to be attached to a design element. It could just live here on the view itself. So I could go ahead and create it just as we've done in a previous part of the course when we created a custom state, and I could call this simply image. Don't have to get too fancy with this. And of course it's an image type of container, an image type field. And then what I could do here is if I delete this action, I could always go element actions and then set the state that we just created, the custom state, right? Set the value of that custom state. In other words, populate this custom state with the image that we're getting from this first step. So the result of step 1. So now after the user uploads an image, it now lives within this custom state, and we can pull the image out of that custom state when we go to save or edit the diary entry. In other words, when the user hits save here and we're creating a new diary entry, we can just set the image value now to the value of that custom state, which of course lives inside of diary entry, create and edit in this image field. And equally, when we're making changes to a diary entry, we could do it inside of here. We could set the image value to be the value of that custom state. So if I go and test this out, I'll just take a photo of my screen here, and I just make this a test diary entry and hit create. If this worked, then in my data tab under app data, I should see a new diary entry. I do, which seems to have something in this image field. Let me click this little pencil icon so we can see things more clearly. And you can see here, indeed, I can actually click on this little C button, and it will open up the image that we just uploaded. And this image, of course, is stored within the file manager. If it doesn't appear right away, just hit search again to refresh this tab. So the image that we just uploaded via the user's device is stored in this big file storage warehouse. But what we also did is on a particular diary entry is we stored that image on the diary entry. And it's actually not so much that we stored it on the diary entry as we stored a reference to the image in the file storage, right? What the value of this image field actually is the address, the URL for this particular image. In other words, this URL here, this is the actual address for this image out on the internet. And I can actually prove that to you if I add a text element onto my diary entry details view and set this to be equal to the diary entry details image field that we just set. You might be going, how does that make sense? You're displaying an image through a text element? Well, yes, I am, because if I go and show you what that actually looks like, you'll see here that there is what looks like a web address. It's the URL for the image that we just uploaded. And I show you that only to stress the point that what we're storing here within our image field on our diary entry data type is not so much the image file itself, but the address for where that image actually lives, which of course is in our application's file storage. And that's useful because without actually storing that address to the image on one of our data types, then it just goes into our file storage, never to be seen again, basically. It's not useful if it's just thrown into the file storage. That's just like putting a letter through the mailbox without writing an address on it. Like, nobody can make use of that information. So in the same way, we can't make use of any of the files in our application unless we actually store the location of that file or save the location of that file onto one of our data types. Now, just before we move on, let's set up our action to add a photo from the user's photo library as well. We're going to set that up in the same way, where we're going to use a very similar action under native mobile called Open Camera Library. We can choose here if we want to select a single photo or multiple photos. In our case, we're just going to have very simple implementation where we're going to have a single photo attached to every diary entry. And then we can do the same thing as we did when we took a photo with the user's camera, which is save the result of that step, that previous step, i.e. the output image, into a custom state. So we can use the same custom state even. So we're going to use set state of an element, so set state of this view. We've got the custom state, just a little container living within the view, and then that temporary container is now going to be populated with the value from this camera library, which incidentally, of course, is going to be the image that the user actually selected. So that's going to be result of step 1, the previous step. And so the end result of this is if I click to choose from library, then I'm going to be able to choose from various images in my photo library. And if I select one and now create this, we should see in our database a new entry, and we do, with that new image attached. Now you might be thinking, okay, next logical step is that we show the image within the interface somewhere, like after the user's selected an image, we should probably show it here within this group. And we're gonna get there, but I want us to just stop actually, because there is a fundamental issue with the way that we've set things up. And if we don't address it now, it's just gonna cause more problems down the line. So issue number 1 with the way that we've set things up is if I take a photo here when I'm creating a new diary entry, and then I end up just closing this view. Well, I haven't created a new diary entry, but nonetheless, the image that the user just uploaded is still in my file storage. And these aren't necessarily going to be small files, right? This one right now is 6.2 megabytes. That's really not an insignificant size. And so over time, these files are just going to start filling up our file storage until either we run out of space or we have to upgrade to a higher plan with a higher file storage limit. You know, but maybe we could live with that. Maybe this is just a prototype. We don't care so much about it. Fine. But the bigger issue with the way that we've set things up comes back to this little checkbox, make this file private. Now, we're going to learn what this means and what this does in much more detail later in the course. But in short, if we don't tick this checkbox, that means that the images in our file storage right now are actually publicly available on the internet. So here's one of the images that I uploaded before. You can see here's actually the web address for this image. And if anybody on the internet visits this URL, this web address, they're going to see this photo. Now, this is the equivalent of creating a Google Doc and setting the permissions to anyone with the link, which effectively means that anybody on the internet, if they have the URL, the website address in simple terms, for your document, then they can access it. This doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to have this address, right? It's not like you're publishing this URL publicly on social media. Nonetheless, if somebody did manage to get this URL, then they could access this Google Doc. And in the same way, they could access your users' photos. Now, depending on what kind of application that you're building, this may be more or less of a concern. If the images that your users are uploading are for a social media site like X or Instagram, then maybe it's not a huge deal because those images are already public. But for other applications, this could be a major privacy and security concern. And so we want to prevent anybody on the internet just being able to access the images that we've got stored in our file storage. And that's where this make this file private checkbox becomes essential. Because what we can do when we tick it is we can say the equivalent of, hey, only the creator of this diary entry can view the image for this diary entry. Problem is that at this point within this action, we already have to specify the diary entry itself. In other words, the diary entry that we are attaching this image to already needs to exist. So we can't upload the image securely and then later, when the save button is clicked, create the diary entry. It doesn't work that way. We've got to first create the diary entry and then upload the image so that the image can be attached to the diary entry. Because that relationship, that attachment, is what's going to allow us to add this logical rule, this security rule, or as we're going to hear it called later on, this privacy rule, which says that only users who have created a trip can view the image attached to that trip. Now, I realize that we're bordering on the abstract here because we haven't actually learned how we secure files. Nonetheless, it is really important that we set this up in the right way now so that when we do learn how we can secure files, that we have the right foundation. And so what we're going to do is we are going to amend our logic for this diary entry create view so that by the time the user uploads an image, either from their camera or their photo library, there is already a diary entry that exists that we can attach that image to. Now we're going to get how to set up this, what we might call a draft diary entry that we can attach an image to in the next lesson.